What's going on, guys? Nick here, and in this video I'm going to show you everything you need to know about iterators and aggregators in make.com to get out there and make money. It will literally be impossible for you not to watch this video from start to finish and walk away with everything that you need, so don't even try me. Very first thing that I'm going to talk about is I'm going to provide you a little bit of background context behind iterators and aggregators. We're going to be looking at a couple of little slideshow pages like this, and then I'm actually going to get into building 10 whole scenarios for you using iterators and aggregators. I wasn't lying when the title said that this was a masterclass. So first and foremost, the majority of confusion around iterators and aggregators in Make is because Make has pretty crappy naming practices. I'm so sorry, Make gods. Please forgive me. Bundles. What the hell are they? Collections, arrays, tables. What does any of this mean, and is it relevant? To be honest, I don't even know, and I'm hoping somebody in the audience can tell me. The good news is you don't actually have to know too much about all of these things in order to get out there and use Make to make money. I hope I've illustrated that to you guys in my introductory Make.com course, Make.com for people who want to make real money. The great news for iterators and aggregators is if you just strip away all of this verbiage into the most simplest parts, they become extraordinarily easy to understand, and you can start using them in your scenarios to save you a ton of operations. If you guys are familiar with operations, it's basically how Make.com charges you for every scenario run, as well as do things much faster and much more efficiently. So that's what we're going to do in this video. I'm literally going to hammer this into your brain by running through 10 different scenarios, leading up to a final culminating scenario that I've shown before on my channel, but that's quite complex. That uses iterators, aggregators, set, get variables. I think I even do some funny mapping in there. We're going to dive into this all over the course of the next hour or two. So first things first, inputs and outputs. If you guys are unfamiliar with inputs and outputs, in Make, every module has what's called an input bundle and an output bundle. Output bundles are pretty self-explanatory. It's just whatever you want the module to do. For instance, if you are using a search rows module, well, it's probably going to be outputting some rows. If you're using a markdown to HTML module, it's probably going to be outputting some HTML. So outputs are pretty simple and easy to understand, but the inputs are where a lot of people trip up. And I run a Make.com community where I show people how to do this stuff. And usually the #1 questions that I get have to do with things that could have been solved in a few moments, just if people understood how inputs worked. So that's what I'm going to do right now for all of you. I have a little example scenario set up here. 0, inputs, outputs, arrays, bundles, and collections. And I have 3 modules. The first is a Google Sheets search rows module. The second is a parse JSON module, which is just going to be responsible for making an array for us. And the third is a set variable module. So I'm just going to connect these 2 together first, and I'm just going to run through what they're doing and how they work. Basically, I have a search rows module set up here, which is going to pull a spreadsheet that I have on my account, nick@leftclick.ai, and it's just going to list all of the results, okay? As you see, there are a bunch of settings here. There is spreadsheet, which I have mapped with the ID of the spreadsheet. You could do this, or you could just select it manually. I've just decided to map it because it's just easier for me to copy and paste the ID of the spreadsheet in. There's the sheet name right over here, which is sheet 1. The table contains headers. This is a setting that we can provide. This is part of our input. Column range, A to CZ, whatever the hell that means. No filter, sort order ascending, order by nothing, maximum number of return rows 3s, maximum number of returned rows 3. Let's actually run this and see what happens. So I gave this a run, and what it's done is it's pulled from this spreadsheet here, which is just a list of dentists, basically, that I had for one of my other clients here that needed a giant list of dentists. And as you see here, we have 2 different sides to this. We have an input bundle. You zoom in here so everybody could see it. And then we have 3 output bundles. And this is really at the core of why you need an iterator and an aggregator in the first place, to be honest. But I'll run you guys through that in a moment. The output bundle is kind of what we expected. You know, this module is called search rows, so it sort of makes sense that the output would just be a bunch of row information, right? If we look on the collection here, we have profile URL, full name, title, row number, spreadsheet, sheet, total number of bundles, bundle order, position 1. If we look back on the actual spreadsheet, we notice that there's a profile URL, full name, and title column. So it's pretty obvious that this is pulling the profile URL from the sheet, then it's pulling the full name from the sheet, then it's pulling the title. And then there's also just some metadata to do with what row number we're at, what the spreadsheet ID is, what the sheet name is, the total number of bundles, bundle order position. Every module in make.com is going to give you slightly different metadata in addition, usually, to the data that you're asking for. And so this is just an artifact of how the Google Sheets API works. Every time you search rows or something like that, it's just going to give you this information. There's nothing you can do about it. And a lot of the time it's valuable. Maybe you'll need this information to use later on or something like that. So they just give it back to you almost as just like, hey, here's some additional information in case you need it. So that's the output. Notice that there are 3 bundles in this output. What a bundle is, we'll get into in a second. But essentially, we have different information in every bundle. The first one is for this woman, Kayla. This next one for this woman, Irene. And this last one's for this person, Kenny, right? And if you look here, this sort of corresponds to the first 3 rows of our spreadsheet. Okay, cool. So that's pretty introductory knowledge, but let's actually get into this input because as you see, there's both an input and an output here. If we check out the input, you'll see that there are a bunch of parameters laid out very similarly to what we saw in the output, but that a lot of people aren't like sort of realizing that we're actually providing to the API, to this Google Sheets search module. So we have a search method called drive, maximum number of return rows, 3, a sheet name, sheet 1, sort order ascending, the spreadsheet ID, the column range, the table contains headers, this value render option, date and time render option. Now the specifics of these keys and these values, they aren't very super important to us. All I mean to show you is that if you just click on these little white circles to the top right of every module after a run, you get a ton of information on what you are supplying to the server or to Google Sheets, and then what you are receiving in return, okay? If you're unfamiliar with what's actually going on behind the hood, essentially make.com is serving as the client in this instance. It's sending a request over to Google Sheets, which is now on the right. Google Sheets has been configured to respond to certain inputs with certain outputs. And so we've structured our input here like this, and Google Sheets, their Google API essentially, reads that input, does something cool and funky behind the confines of this gray rectangle, and then sends it back to us as a response, which we are reading down here in the output. So that's how make.com inputs and outputs work. Keep in mind that there are both inputs and outputs. Most people only ever look at the outputs and they sort of wonder why their scenarios aren't working. If you guys understand that, you'll probably save yourself a few hours of debugging just over the course of the next couple of weeks. That takes me to another very important concept, and that concept is, Nick, what the hell is a bundle? Well, bundles are, as I mentioned, simply make.com nomenclature. Make.com just pulled the word bundle out of their ass, and we are all suffering now because of it. But essentially, a bundle, or a collection, or the two are slightly different, but essentially a bundle is just one execution of your scenario. Every time you get a bundle, at the beginning of a scenario, the subsequent modules in that scenario will run. So if you have one bundle, every module after the module that outputted that one bundle will run once. If you have 2 bundles, every module after the output of those initial 2 modules will run twice. If you have 3, it'll run 3 times. If you have 5, it'll run 5 times. If you have n, which I'm just going to use as a placeholder variable, it will run n times. You'll know that something is a bundle because it'll say bundle 1 in purple over here, like we see. Now let's actually look at this in practice, because it's one thing to see it on a hastily written Gamma spreadsheet. It's another thing entirely to see it in make.com. So first and foremost, if I click on this and I scroll down, you'll notice that the bottom field here says maximum number of returned rows, and then it's set to 3. So if I were to turn this to 1, and then if I were to give this a run, the output of this module is just 1 bundle, right? If I were to turn this to 3 and then run, the output of this module is now 3 bundles, okay? Now, instead of just right-clicking and then running this module only, I'm actually going to run the entire scenario and show you guys how it works. So first we have this Google Sheets search rows module, and it's connected to another variable here called example variable. And all I'm doing is I'm adding this profile URL and I'm turning it into a variable. Let's actually just call this profile URL. Now, in reality, there's basically no reason why you'd actually want to do this, because you already have a variable called profile URL, which has the URL of the profile up here, right? But I'm just doing this as an example. Don't get your knickers in a twist. I'm going to click this run once module. I don't know why I said that. I'm going to click this run once module. And we're going to see what happens with these 3 bundles, all right? Let me give it a go. something very interesting just occurred. Essentially, if you click on the white little bubble up here by the search rows module, you'll notice that 3 bundles were output. And then after, every module after the 3 bundles were output ran 3 times. That's why there's operation 1, operation 2, operation 3. And you'll see what ended up happening is we fed in a different profile URL to this variable every single time. Essentially what happened is we're selecting profile URL up here, right? And then every time a new bundle is run, it will select a different profile URL. So the first time it'll select this one up here. The second time it'll select this one over here. And then the third time it'll select this one over here. And then we also have 3 executions or 3 operations that were used where we have input and then output. And notice how the input is different for every single one. If you look at the input for the set variable module in operation 1, well, you'll see that this corresponds to the first row in our spreadsheet. The second input is another bundle. This corresponds to the second row in our spreadsheet. The third operation is a third bundle, and it corresponds to the third value of our spreadsheet here. Don't pay attention to the fact that it says bundle 1 or bundle 1 or bundle 1. These correspond to the 3 bundles that we generated earlier. Unfortunately, another downside of Make.com's naming practices is that they don't carry over the bundle number with them from one module to another. Regardless, this was the first operation, this is the second operation, and this is the third. All right, so as I mentioned previously, that's how bundles work. Every time you output more than one bundle, every module in a scenario will run as many times as you have bundles. Output 27 bundles from your first trigger scenario, well, every other module in your scenario, even if you have 20, are going to run 27 times. If you do the math and you try and figure out how many operations this is going to cost you, you can see that this sort of thing would add up pretty fast. I mean, if you have 10 modules in the scenario and every module runs 10 times, 10 times 10 is 100 total operations, right? You can only really do that a certain number of times before you run out of operations, and then Make.com price gouges you for another $4.82 or whatever. So that's what bundles are. Let's talk a little bit about arrays. Arrays, instead of bundles, are numbered lists of data. If we just look at the way that this looks, like if we just look at the aesthetics of it, you'll see that in the previous page, we had an output, and we had bundle 1, bundle 2, bundle 3. Here we have an array, and then the array just has numbers, 1, 2, or 3. If you feed in an array into a scenario, if you have 1 item in the array, it'll run your scenario once. If you have 2 items in the array, it'll still run your scenario once. If you have 3 items, it'll run once. If you have 5 items, it'll run once. If you have n items, it'll always just run once. Basically, an array will not trigger a scenario to run multiple times. It'll only run once, regardless of how many items are in that array. So whereas with bundles, the number of times the scenario runs is going to depend on the number of bundles that you feed in. With arrays, the number of items in the array has no impact on the number of times that the rest of the scenario is going to run. A very easy way to know that something is an array is just to look at it, and then if it has a gray little piece of text there that says array, well, I'm not a scientist, but that'll obviously be an array. So let me give you another practical example here. Previously, we were using this Google Sheets search rows module, right? And you see the output of this is profile URL, full name, title, because we're pulling from this spreadsheet over here. Well, what if, hypothetically, I was sneaky and I created another module here that instead of outputting multiple bundles, outputs an array with the same data? Let's give this a little zoom. As you see, we have an array with 3 items. We have title, full name, profile URL, title, full name, profile URL, title, full name, profile URL. This is a singular bundle, and inside of that bundle, we have an array that generates 3 of these collections, which I'll touch on in a moment. Essentially, the data here is virtually the same as the data we had before, but the way that it's formatted is different. And because the way that it's formatted is different, if we were to try and feed this into the set variable module, well, look at what happens. Our variable selector looks very different indeed. Instead of having access to all of those variables before that we did with the spreadsheet ID and all that stuff, now we only have access to a single array that contains title, full name, and profile URL. Furthermore, if we give one of these a click, you'll see that there is a space between the left-hand side of this variable and then the right-hand side of this variable. Because this space is asking us, hey, which array element do you want us to select? This is called array indexing. Let me give you an example. If I wanted the full name of the second entry here, I would go array to title. And if I give this a run, you'll see that it's now pulling. Hold on 1 second. Oh, sorry, I don't want a title. I want the full name. I take that back. Okay, if I wanted the second full name here, I put 2. Now give this a run. Look at what happens. We receive Peter Locks. If we look at our array here, Peter Locks was number 2. Now let's say I want to grab Kayla Sands here. If I go back here and then I say 1 instead, click run once, well, now we've indexed Kayla Sands' name. And if we want to do this lady Anne Marie, click OK. Now we have that lady Anne Marie. The point that I'm making is the number of elements in this array has no bearing on the number of times that the scenario runs. Instead, it's just presented to us as like this data structure that we can then index to take specific objects from, right? And that's why the two types of pickers look very different, because one is running on a bundle basis and the other one's running on like an array basis, basically. So anytime that you select an object and it's sort of split into 2 parts like this, you're manipulating an array. In my case, my array variable is literally called array, but if you want to see if something's an array, just look for these 2 little brackets beside it, like this, one left square bracket and then one right square bracket. Anything there will be an array. And then it'll also ask you, if you select an element within the array, to index it like this. I believe if you don't select one, it'll just automatically select the first. Let's see. Yes, it automatically selects the first element in the array if you don't select one. Let's run this with the full name variable, and then we see that's Kayla Sands. But you can manually say, I want the third one, I want the second one, I want the first one. Okay, so that's how arrays work. In a nutshell, the way that this corresponds to iterators and aggregators is as follows. An iterator will turn a set like an array into a bunch of bundles. An aggregator will turn a bunch of bundles into an array. That's basically it. There's no real magic behind it now that you understand these concepts. All we're really doing is we're just changing the way that the scenario data is formatted from before, like where we're using this Google Sheets, from bundles to arrays, that would be an aggregator, or from an array into a bunch of bundles, which would be an iterator. And I'm going to show you how all of that works now with a bunch of practical scenarios and practical examples where we'll manipulate the data and I'll talk you guys through it. And by the end of these 10 practical examples, you guys will know everything that you need to know in order to make make.com iterators and aggregators work for you. All right. So the very first example I have here is that many modules have built-in iterators. Many modules, usually modules with names like search or find or list or get or that sort of thing, will have built-in iterators already. That just means that most of you guys already understand how iterators work because you've been using them all along. It's just when you actually drag the iterator module into play that things start being a little more complex. Let me show you what I mean. I have an example scenario set up here. The way that this example scenario works is we are pulling from the same Google Sheet that I was pulling before, okay? That's what the search rows module does. We're selecting 3 returned rows. If I go back here, you'll see that the first 3 here are Kayla, Irene, and Kenny. So if I were to run this, what do you guys think is going to happen? Well, the output is going to be Kayla, Irene, and Kenny. Next up, I have a set multiple variables module. And the purpose of this module is I'm going to be creating a custom subject line using the person's first name as input. What I want is I want a subject line that says something like this. Because I'm going to be using this in an email sequence later on. I want it to look casual. I want it to be sort of grammatically incorrect. I want people to think that I actually saw Kayla's profile. I sat down and then I wrote this myself. This is a real flow that I use in a ton of my cold emailing applications, where if you send somebody a really formal looking subject line and say, "Dearest Kayla, I would love to serenade you with whatever," she's going to look at that and instantly put that in the trash. But if you were to say something like, "Hey Kayla, -- saw your profile," she's like 30 times more likely to open it. It's a little bit of cold email magic, but that's not the point of the course. Anywho, how would we actually go about doing this, dynamically getting the full name? If you're familiar with how make.com splitting operations works, then give it a quick pause and try and do it for yourself. If not, what we're going to do is we're going to write the word hey, then I'm going to put a space, and then I'm going to say split the full name here by the presence of a space. I use these 2 little curly brackets to instantly grab variables that you can also find over here in the variable picker. I just do it a little bit faster that way. So what I'm doing now is I'm grabbing this full name, I'm splitting it by the presence of a space, I'm turning this string into 3 elements. It's basically now a 3-element array. And then what I want to do is I want to wrap this in a get function which allows me to pick specific things from the array. And I'm going to pick the first one. Then I'm going to add a little dash, and I'll say saw your profile, just like this. That's what this currently looks like. I then have a Gmail module over here where I can select the subject line, I can add content, I can add a recipient, I can do all that fun stuff. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to select drafts, I believe. Then the email address, I'm going to do this. I'm just going to do my own because I don't actually want to send any emails to anybody, and I'm just going to write test. Okay, great. Now I'm going to unlink this Gmail module just because I want to test what's going on before the Gmail module and show you how iterators and aggregators work in respect to this. As we see, the maximum number of return rows is 3. I'm going to set that to 1, and I'm just going to run this. So what ended up happening is we fed that in as input that the maximum number of return rows is going to be 1. And then the data that we got as output was Kayla, general dentist, yada, yada. The variable that we were using from this was full names. That's the only one that really we should be manipulating. And as you see, the input here was subject line, hey Kayla, saw your profile. The output is hey Kayla, saw your profile. Essentially, this worked for us. If I were to, say, convert this to 3 rows instead of 1 row, then give this a run, you'll see that this is already technically iterating over our data because this search rows module actually just natively has an iterator built in. We outputted multiple bundles. Here's 1, 2, and 3. And for every bundle, we had 1 run of the subsequent module, which is this. So as you see, the first one said, hey, Kayla. The second one said, hey, Irene. And the third one said, hey, Kenny. Now, if we connect this to the Gmail module, I'm actually not sure if this is going to work, but we're going to give it a go regardless. You could see that not only did the second module here run 3 times, but also the third module here ran 3 times. The reason why is because basically at every module, the number of bundles output by that module will multiply by the number of bundles output by the next module to get the total number of bundles output by the subsequent module. So if this module here output 3 bundles, 1, 2, 3, then this module here output 1 bundle each, 1, 1, and 1. The total output of this is 3 for the subsequent module. If hypothetically we did some data structure here where we had an iterator that iterated over the bundles or something, then we just keep on multiplying those out until you get the total number of executions or runs at that last module. But in this case, it's 3 times 1 is equal to 3. Pretty simple to understand, right? Now, the reason why I'm showing you this is because I just want to make it clear that most people that are using make.com and are probably at the point where they're like watching this video have already used iterators and have already used aggregators, even if you don't think that you have, because tons of modules just have that functionality built into them, which is very convenient. All right, so that's many modules have built-in iterators. Let's learn a little bit about what we do if there is no built-in iterator and we're forced to do it ourselves. Let's hypothesize, that's a fancy word. Let's hypothesize and let's just pretend that we're getting the exact same data that we got in the previous example. The only difference is now it's an array instead of a series of bundles. Well, our iterators turn an array into a series of bundles, right? So if we want to get the same result, if we want to send 3 emails, all with 3 separate subject lines, we're going to have to add an iterator module. So that's what we're going to be doing. And I'll talk about this rule of thumb, and I'll talk about the inputs and outputs in a second. But essentially, this is what the scenario is going to look like. Let me just copy this over here and make it the same. Basically, instead of having the Google Sheets module like we had previously, what I've done is I've just created my own array using this parse.json module. And that's not very important for the purpose of this video. What is important is that if you click run this module once, the output is you get this array. And in the array, you basically get the same looking data as we got previously. It's just now it's an array format as opposed to bundles. So we have the title, we have the full name, we have the profile URL, right? Now, if I click on this, and then if I try and do the same thing that I did over here with subject line, how could I possibly, like if you just pause the video here for a second and try and think, how could you possibly get the same result with 3 different subject lines, each corresponding to a dynamic full name? You really couldn't unless you use an iterator. Like, I mean, subject line, the maximum subject line I'd be able to do is I'd have to manually index these 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's say there's 100, right? I'd have to basically create a router with 100 different outputs, and then I'd have to connect that to 100 different of these modules, and then I'd have to manually select 100 different things. That's super ludicrous and basically impossible to do. certainly not feasible and not something you should be doing. So what we have to do is we have to transform this data structure here into a series of bundles so that we can just dynamically grab one variable at a time, as opposed to having to index it like we're doing here. And that's where the Iterator module comes in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this little green flow control, and you'll see that the very second result here is called Iterator. It's because it's one of the most common ones that are used in make.com. All you have to do is just drag this in front of whatever module has the array. I'm just going to auto align this, spread this out a little bit more. Then if you click on it, what we need to do is we need to feed in an array. And all you need to do is just click on the top level array, the one with the two little brackets. So as you see, this variable here, it's convenient that it's called array, but even if it wasn't called array, as long as it has these two little brackets on it, we're good. Oops. And then I'm going to unlink this. And then I'm just going to run this with the iterator so we see what happens. Okay, so we ran the generate array first. So we've generated an array with 3 elements, right? Now what happens when you feed it into an iterator? Well, as you see, the input at the top corner here was our array, general dentist, Kayla Sands, profile URL. But the output of this run is 3 different bundles, each that have basically the same data that we had before, as well as some silly little metadata here, like which bundle that, which array element it was that was output. For instance, this Kayla Sands, this was bundle order position 1. Peter Locks was bundle order position 2, right? This actually sort of keeps track of it, which could be useful in some cases, but for most cases it probably isn't. Now that we have the output in this bundle format, well, if you think back to it, that's basically the exact same output format that we got over here, right? So if we go here, and if we connect this, now what we can do is we can actually use the data from this iterator as part of our flow. So if I do the same thing that I did before, where I split the presence of this full name based off of a space, and then I get the very first result, and then I write saw your profile, then if I unlink this from the Gmail module, just because I want to test this up until this last module here, let's see what happened. We had 1 run of generate array, 1 run of the iterator, now we had 3 runs of this set multiple variables module. And in every run, we have the dynamic first name that's being pulled essentially, because we're doing that cool string manipulation. And now if we feed this into our Gmail module, which I'm probably going to have to update because I just copied that from another module below. And now if we run it, how many runs is this Gmail module going to generate? Pause the video and just give it a quick think before proceeding. Three. The reason why is because we went from 1 times 1 is 1, then we went 1 times 1, 2, 3, 3 is 3, and then we went 3 times 1 is 3. And so basically this generate array generated 1 bundle, then we took it into an iterator, and then we took that 1 bundle, turned it into 3 because we iterated over the array. And then we set 3 different variables here, and then we used it to create 3 different Gmail drafts. So the good rule of thumb here is anytime you're sort of not sure of exactly what to do with an iterator, just always use the green variables from that iterator in subsequent modules, because that will contain the data that you want. As you see, we have a title variable, full name variable, profile URL variable, whatever. One thing that really used to screw me up initially was I would keep on using this array variable, key values instead of the iterator key values. And I just never really understand why this would work. But essentially, this iterator just runs it on a bundle by bundle basis, whereas this array is just going to run once per bundle, which is unfortunate. So yeah, just always try and use the green variables here as opposed to the variables from previous modules. And if you're ever unsure what's going on, just look at the inputs and the outputs. I've tried to really drill this in over the course of the last 15 or 20 minutes, however long this has been so far. But the inputs and outputs is just the easiest way to know what's going on. And you can usually diagnose the hell out of your own flows just by clicking on these little things after they run, seeing what was fed in. As you see, an array was fed in, the iterator did its job, fed in the output. Okay, great, let's take a look at this. Unfortunately, the set variable modules are a little bit trickier because they don't actually show you the logic that was done, but that's okay. We can look at the Gmail module as well, right? Here's the input. We have copy recipient, to, blind copy recipient, attachments, right? All of this data is basically fed in, content test, and then you can see the subject line was fed in as well. So when you go through the output, the Gmail module just gives you a bunch of like message IDs and stuff. The reason why it does that is because you can actually feed in the message IDs into subsequent modules to pull the specific message to see it for yourself. But every module will output something different. But yeah, that's more or less how you do it yourself. Okay, so that's cool. But what exactly is an array? What exactly happens every time I click on one of these, and then on the right-hand side it says collection, it says array? How exactly do I take that and then do something cool with it? Well, in order to understand arrays and collections and really all the different data structures in make.com, you need to understand what a key to value pair is. And key value pairs are at the core of how make.com works, and basically just in general how programming works. This is basically what a variable is. For instance, if I had a variable called first name and the value of it was Nick, in this case, first name would be the key, Nick would be the value. You can also think of it as first name is the variable, Nick is the result or value of the variable, right? If I were to do a more practical example, and if I were just to click into our first result here, sorry, my back is killing me. I've been on this little plastic chair for like 7 hours today, so don't hate me for moving around. If I were to click into this, you'll see that there are a bunch of these purple, there's a bunch of text in purple, and then there's a bunch of text just in like black over here. Basically, all the text in purple here, this is a key, and then this is the corresponding value of that key. So the key of profile URL has a value of this big URL here. The key of full name has this value of this Kayla. The title key has the value of general dentist. This row number key is a value of 2, right? If you try and use this in subsequent modules here, like in the fields, the variables themselves, you'll see that we can actually select this. But what we're clicking on really is we're clicking on the key, right? This spreadsheet ID, the name of that is key. The sheet, the name of that is a key, right? The value is sheet 1, but the name of it is this. So when I click full name, like what I'm doing is I'm pulling a key, right? So that's at the core of basically how anything in programming works, to be honest. But once you know that, you start to understand how collections and how arrays work. And really, the way that make.com has defined them, although they won't really tell you how they define them, or maybe they have and I'm just too lazy and I haven't read them, is that a collection is just any group of key to value pairs. Whereas an array is just groups of collections of collections or of key to value pairs. I know that that's a mouthful, so let me show you a practical example. In our no built-in iterator, here's how to do it yourself run. If we were to give this a quick little click, you'll see that we have an array here, and inside of the array we have 3 collections. If I give this a little click, the collection is a set of key value pairs. So title, general dentist, full name, Kayla, profile URL, here's the URL. An array in this instance is simply an array is simply a collection of it. No, it's not a collection. Rewind the video really quickly. An array is just a set of collections or key to value pairs. What I mean by that? Well, I mean, like, technically we could have an additional value here, which is just a key to value pair. I could give this a little try here. I think. If that breaks, then I'm going to cry. Yeah, that totally broke. You could just put a number there instead, though. Okay, so basically what we've done here is we've created an additional variable, and the variable just has a value of 3. It's given this sort of, it's not really a key, but it's given like a key of 4 here, basically, and then the value of it is 3. I could not have picked a more confusing example. But essentially, this isn't a collection, this is just a value, but it's still technically an array, right? So an array can contain collections, key value pairs, or it can also just contain values like this. Contrast that with an array, contrast that with a collection. A collection like this typically just contains key to value pairs. And sometimes these keys can have collections within them as well. So what do I mean by this? Well, if I go back to all this fancy looking code, then I create a new one. I'm now essentially creating an additional collection item inside of this. And our thing is growing more and more needlessly complex. You see that this array now has a collection inside of it, and this collection has a key value pair, another key value pair, and a third key value pair, but then it also has another collection with another key value pair inside. So to keep things simple, because that's really the point of this, you can essentially have an arbitrary number of key to value pairs or collections within either a collection or an array. But just think about collections as any group of key to value pairs, and then just think about arrays as groups of collections and or key to value pairs. Very, very simple way of looking at things. Now I'm going to show you a practical example of what this might look like. this is our module here. This is our scenario here called 3. Okay, but how do you work with arrays and collections? As you can see, I put a lot of thought into naming these things. If I give this a run, see that we now have an array, but our array looks a little bit different than the old one. Previously, we simply had the title, full name, and profile URL, but I've actually went through and I've added an additional collection inside of every collection inside of the array with 2 new key value pairs, email provider and email address. And so inside of every one, you can see that we have an email provider, Google or Outlook or Google. And then inside further, we have the email address of the person. These are fake email addresses that I've generated just for the purposes of this example. But the good news is we can now map that dynamically and then feed that into our Gmail module. And the mechanics of what I'm going to do here aren't any different, but I want to show you the value in understanding how these things are defined and how they work, because it does give you a ton of latitude in make.com. So I have to create my own subject line again. So I'm just going to do this so that I can show you guys how to do string manipulation really quickly. So this is me manipulating a string, and I'm writing saw your profile again. And then maybe what I also want to do is I want to manipulate the provider name, which I'll find over here, email provider, and I want to turn that into a lowercase thing. What you'll see is happening is that we're actually indexing the variable. You see it's under email, and then it says email provider. When you see a format like this, the reason why you're seeing it is because this is the title of the key in the collection, key for the collection. So email is the key for the subsequent collection of 2 key value pairs of email provider, Google email address, Anne Marie, and AM Dental. And so that's what this is referring to. This is saying, hey, email is a collection, and then the key that we're looking at is actually inside of the email key, and it's called the email provider. You don't need to know or memorize all this stuff. I'm just pointing this out for sheer interest. Once you've done that, you could theoretically add a filter, and it could only add emails, only send emails if the provider is Outlook. You can imagine how maybe you are having some specific business purpose where you only want to email Outlook emails, or maybe you're a little skeptical of the deliverability of non-Outlook emails. So what we're doing now is I've essentially added a filter. And the reason why I've done this is just to show you how both the indexing works and also how deeply nested you can access variables using Iterator. But if we look at the input and output pairs of all the modules before, you'll see the first one is an array. And it has this email collection, right, with the email provider and email address. This iterator then takes the array and then it converts it into bundles. And it also keeps the place of all of the key value pairs or collections therein. So we can now access all of the same information. It's just instead of it being an array, now it's in bundles, so we can dynamically map it. And then we have this set multiple variables module, which I showed you before. And what this is doing is it's taking in the subject line, and then it's also making the provider name lowercase. So Google goes to a lowercase g, Outlook goes to a lowercase o. This runs 3 times because it runs once for every bundle, right? And then we have a filter module here, and the filter will also run once per bundle. And so essentially what we've said in the filter is we want this to be equal to Outlook, and only if it's equal to Outlook do we want to continue. And if we click on this little button here, it'll show us the results of the filter. It says for the first bundle that went through, for Kayla, provider lowercase equals Outlook, this failed. This did not pass. For the second person, Irene, provider lowercase equals Outlook, this passed because it is. And then for the third person, Kenny, provider lowercase equals Outlook, this also failed. And so this didn't pass. And so basically 2 of these 3 runs were caught right here, and only 1 run continued to this Gmail module, which is why there's 3 runs here and only 1 run here. And you see that this one for Peter, this one actually ran, and we ended up creating a draft, and we have a big message ID with that draft now as well. So that's how you work with arrays and collections. That's sort of what they mean and what they're referring to. Again, just to keep it really simple, this is how I personally define them. Collections are just any group of key to value pairs, and then arrays are just groups of collections or key to value pairs. You can add arrays within collections, and you can add collections within arrays, as we've both seen. So this is just a quick and easy sort of rule of thumb that should help you guys understand a little bit more about the differences of these 2 data types. All right, now let's actually get out there and use our iterator knowledge with a practical example, which is going to be us iterating over an API. Now, if this is the first time you guys have worked with an API, don't fear. It's very similar just to using like one of the make.com modules. It's just instead of using a built-in make.com module, we're just sort of making our own with this HTTP request. What I have over here is I have an API set up, which isn't super important, but I've shown this in my how to scrape any website with make.com video. And what we're doing is we're feeding in just a bunch of these headers over here. And if you're unfamiliar with how headers work or why they're important or whatnot, then just check out my how to scrape any website with make.com video. But essentially, the reason I'm showing you this is if I run this, right click and click run this module only, you'll see that the output of this was a bundle. And inside of that bundle, we have a bunch of key value pairs. We have status code 200. Then we have an array with a bunch of headers. And inside of this headers array, we have a bunch of collections. If I scroll down a little bit, you'll see we also have cookie headers. And then most importantly, we have this data collection. And inside of this data collection, we also have a key called data with the value being this massive array. If I click this, you'll see that we basically have what looks like 60 different collections within that array. Now, I know that that was a mouthful to get through, but the reason I'm showing you this is because this is basically how every API that you're ever going to interact with for tabular data, for data that has like multiple versions of it, are going to interact. Now, this is how you are going to take data from an API and then make it usable within make.com. Because this whole array right, like this doesn't actually mean anything. If you think about it, if I were to try and access the contents of this in any future flow, it'd be virtually impossible for me to do so, because again, I'd have to index the specific value. In order for me to get the very first one, I have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We don't want to have to do this manually every time. We'd prefer a solution where we just feed it in once and then we can access whatever variable the specific bundle or run is on, right? So that's where the Iterator module comes in. What you need to do in order to access this is you need to find your array, which in our case is this data variable here. And then you need to feed that in as the input to the iterator. And as you see, the way I did this was I went to data and then I clicked on data here because it has that little bracket here and it even says array. If I mouse over this, immediately to the right of data, we see a smaller than or less than symbol, then the word array, and then a greater than symbol. So this is the one that we want. And if I just remove all of the subsequent modules just to show you what this data looks like, if I run this again, what you'll see is we're going to feed an array with 60 objects. And the result is going to be 60 bundles, all with data from our API. Now the data from our API in particular this time, is just a bunch of like residential, or sorry, I guess like commercial data about real estate. So it's giving us like address, it's giving us the number of square footage, it's giving us the number of items, the brokerage name, all that stuff. And this is very important for one of my real estate clients forever ago. But the really cool part about this is now that we have this in this format, we can actually go through and then use it in make.com to do stuff with, right? So I have this Google Sheets add a row module here. And basically what this is doing is it's taking the data and it's just dumping it into this sheet, which is empty at present. And the whole idea here is now that we've added an iterator, we can actually we can actually go through and add data from every single one of these element items. And we can just put that in our Google Sheet. We can basically take it from an API and then dump it somewhere where we can do stuff with it, or maybe our client wants it or something like that, right? So that's what I've done here. I've pushed this through an iterator. I ran the iterator once, and when you run the iterator once, you all of a sudden get access to all of the variables inside. And so I've now just went through the list and I've added all of these to different columns. So column C is brokerage name, column D is description, column E is has flyer, column F is has OM. I don't actually know what all of these mean specifically, but I hope that that's a pretty good example of what's going on. Then at the end, I have a sleep module, which sleeps for 1 second because I want to let the Google Sheets API cool down just a little bit. I am doing 60 API calls here, right? So if I do 60 API calls and I just try and run it all at the same time, there's a chance that maybe the Google Sheets API will have a fit and they're not going to like it, so they're going to throttle me or something. I want to eliminate this by giving myself basically a delay of 1 second per run, which is pretty simple to do. All you have to do is just drag a sleep module and add it to the end. Now you're thinking, well, this is at the end. Why is this going to work? Well, it's going to work because you have multiple bundles. And every time you have multiple bundles, basically what happens is it will go through every entry, every module subsequent to the one that outputs multiple bundles, and it'll run it once before it starts with the next. So basically what's going to happen is we run this once. This is going to run once. Now we're going to have 60 things to go through. But the way the 60 things are going to go through are item 1 is going to start here, then go here. Item 2 is going to start here, then go here. Item 3 is going to start here, then go here. And I'm going to get that 1 second every single time I run. So let's actually give this a run and let's see what happens in practice. As you see here, we've ran this once. We outputted that big thing of data. We've now iterated over all of the 60 items in the array. We've turned them into bundles, and now we're just iterating over every bundle. What's happening is we're running number 14, number 15, number 16, number 17, and basically they're about a second apart, where this one runs and then we wait 1 second until this finishes. This one runs, we wait 1 second until this finishes. And I'm not going to stop this because I actually want to show you guys, but do keep in mind that this is consuming operations, right? This is going to consume 60 ops at the end. This is going to consume 60, and this is going to consume 2. So in total, this run, this example that I'm doing is going to consume 122 ops. As you see, we are adding all of these row-wise into our Google Sheet, which is pretty nice and sexy. And yeah, this is just a quick example of what you could do with really any API, scraping any sort of data, and then turning that data into tabular data that you can then put into a CRM. You could put into a project management system. You could turn into a document, right? Maybe these represent the fields in like a PandaDoc or something, and that's how you're filling in this beautiful looking proposal, right? There are a variety of different ways that you could do this. Now, because I want to have this stop, I'm just waiting until 60 here. You don't actually have to wait. Okay, great. So now that this is done, if I click on the results of this, you'll see that there are 60 operations, each with their own input and their own output. The reason why there's their own input and their own output is because for every new row, we're actually adding different information, right? So this is the information that we're adding as our input to the first bundle. This is the information that we're adding as input to our second bundle, third, fourth, fifth, all the way down to operation number 60 below. Every time the scenario finishes, it actually gives us a return with just a list of updates. And again, this is just specific metadata just to Google Sheets, just to this particular module. Every module that you run is going to have slightly different metadata. But yeah, this is the result. If I were a little bit smarter, I probably would have added a header field because now I have no idea what any of these mean, but c'est la vie, live and learn. You can also just add a header field by right-clicking and clicking insert one row above and then just manually writing them all out here. But this is just an example, so I'm not super wedded to this or anything. So yeah, that's how this works. Just know that anytime you're doing an HTTP call, it's usually going to return responses in a data object. That data object is usually going to be an array of a bunch of tabular data, unless you're just like trying to request one resource, right? Sometimes APIs give you one resource. Sometimes APIs have endpoints that give you multiple resources. This specifically corresponds to those multiple resources. All right, congratulations. If you are at this point in the video, you now know basically everything you need to know about iterators in order to make them work and in order to make good money with them. Literally, iterators are not any more complex than that. They're super straightforward, and as long as you follow everything that I've showed you here, you're going to be completely and utterly fine. Don't worry about it. From now on, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss aggregators. And aggregators, to be honest, are a little bit more complex than iterators, and it's also like, why the hell would I ever want an aggregator? So I'm going to show you guys some reasons why you might want to run aggregators. I'm going to show you how they work, why you end up with this weird little dark section all of a sudden in your make.com scenarios. And then I'm going to combine that with what we learned about iterators early on, and then use both iterators and aggregators in one flow before I show you my master super complicated content generator flow, which makes gratuitous use of both. All right, so what are aggregators? Well, first of all, aggregators are basically the exact opposite of iterators. You know how earlier we talked about iterators converting an array into a list of bundles, right? Well, all an aggregator does is it turns a bunch of bundles into an array. And you're probably wondering, why the hell could you ever possibly want to convert a bunch of bundles into an array? Aren't bundles so much more useful? You don't need to index specific elements like we showed earlier. You don't need to do anything like that. Well, they're useful because once you turn a series of bundles into an array, you can now run array functions on them. And this can save you both tons of operations. It can also open up completely new use cases. And there are a couple of additional things that you could do with text aggregators and numeric aggregators just in one module, which save you a little bit of time, energy, and money, realistically. So that all sounds pretty theoretical, but what does this actually look like in practice? Well, I'm going to go back to our very first example where we just had a Google Sheet, and that Google Sheet was spitting out a bunch of bundles just to show you guys how the aggregator works, run through some very basic examples. So we have the Google Sheets search rows module here, right? If I give this a click, you'll see that I'm pulling the exact same spreadsheet that I was pulling before. That's this one over here. I'm feeding in the same sheet name. All that information is exactly the same. And I'm returning, let's just do 5 rows instead of 50. Now, if I run this, what do you think is going to happen? I'm just running this one module only. I'm not running the whole flow. If I just try and search up 5 Google Sheets rows, what do you think I'm going to get? How many bundles is it going to be? What's the data going to look like? Well, if I click this run once, you'll see that I've outputted 5 bundles because this Google Sheets search rows module actually has a built-in iterator, right? It's generating multiple bundles. Now, the purpose of an aggregator is to turn these 5 bundles into one bundle that contains an array that has 5 elements. And I'll show you how that works right now. We have an array aggregator here, and I'm just going to select a new one. The way that you do so is you go to flow control, then you select array aggregator. It's right below Iterator. Then just drag it into the scenario. And then when you click on it, you'll see it has way more options than an iterator. It has a source module, it has a target structure type, and then it has a bunch of aggregated fields. The only thing you need to know is that the source module should just be whatever is outputting multiple bundles, and that's it. Whatever is first starting to output all of the bundles, that's what you want as your source module. If you had 5 other things in here, right, if I just put another module in here and then I space this out, you'll see that I can now select 2, this tools and this Google Sheets. Well, this multiple variables, this is not outputting multiple bundles. The thing that's outputting multiple bundles is this Google Sheets search rows module. That's the one that I want as my aggregator source module. So that's what I'm going to set. And when I do this, and if I click, you'll see a little gray background is going to encapsulate everything between the aggregator and that source module. And this is basically just make.com telling you that all the data outside is inaccessible. I'll cover that in a second. But anyway, so now that we've selected this, we actually have to select some fields. Because I added this general dentist variable here, we can see that we actually have it accessible. It'll show you the module, and then it'll show you all the variables within said module. So for the purposes of demo, I'm actually just going to delete that again, make it nice and simple for us. Okay, so now all we have is the Google Sheets search rows module, and then we have all the variables that are accessible to us here. Now, the only variables I want to pull from this to make my array is profile URL, full name, and title. I know that we're outputting some additional metadata like row number, spreadsheet ID, sheet. I know that. I don't really want any of that data in my new array. The great part about aggregators is you get to choose the data that is going to populate your new array. So you have a lot of choice over it. So to make my life as simple as possible, I'm only going to grab the data that I need here, which are these 3. Now that I have this, I'm going to disconnect the subsequent module, and I'm just going to run these 2 to show you how this works. I'm going to get a warning because aggregators should usually not be the last module in the route, but that's okay. All right, so I've now run this, and what we see is the output of the first module is we see 5 bundles, just as we were expecting. Now, as we follow this gray darked out section here and we click on the array aggregator output, you'll see what happened. The input to this was 5 bundles with the title, with the profile URL, the full name, and then the title, because those are the only 3 things that we selected in the array aggregator. And then the output of this is now, instead of 5 bundles, we only have 1. And inside of that 1 bundle is an array, and inside of that array is 5 elements, each with keys values that correspond to the data that we had in the individual bundles above. So essentially what we've done is we've done the exact opposite of what we had previously. Previously, we went from arrays to bundles, and now we're going from bundles to arrays. And that is what the output of that specific flow looks like. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little contrived example here, but I want to show you guys why array aggregators are actually valuable and not just a complete and utter waste of your time. I'm going to go over here to our Google Sheet where we're pulling the data from. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just add a duplicate. So you see this person here, Irini. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste this. And so now what we have is we have a duplicate. So of the 5 records that we have here, 2 of these are going to be the same. I'm going to run this just to show you guys what this looks like in Make. You'll see we have Kayla, we have Irini, and then we have Kenny, and then Colin. Now, the reason why this is valuable is because if you didn't let's say we were trying to get rid of duplicates. If you didn't use an aggregator, the only way to get rid of duplicates, or the alternative way to get rid of duplicates, would consume a fair number of modules. If you use an aggregator, you can do the deduplication in one operation in one step, just using a single module here. Because it's now an array, we have the privilege of using array operations or array functions on them. And if you go over here to this functions for arrays section, there are tons of different options here that you could choose from. The one that I'm curious and the one that I really care about is this deduplicate one. So what I'm going to do is the deduplicate function just finds similar array options. And if you have more than one of the same array option inside of your array, it'll just remove it for you. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to feed in an array with 5 elements as the input, and then to have 4 elements be the output. Because again, we are deduplicating, we're removing that additional one from Irini. I'm going to click start and let's see what happens. So Google Sheets module, we outputted 5 bundles. That's as expected. Array aggregator, we fed in 5 bundles and turned those into an array with 5 elements. 2 of which are the same as expected. Then we fed this into this tools module, and we'll see that we fed in, the output of this is a general dentist array with only 4 elements. And the reason why is because we got to leverage the deduplicate function that you would not have been able to run on a per bundle basis to just take all that data, really quickly filter it, and output set array. Now, what's really cool about this is now we can go to the flow control and we can just iterate over the data again. So we could just feed in this array, and now we can run it, and now we get the exact same thing that we had before with 4 different bundles. With multiple different bundles, meaning all subsequent modules are going to run multiple times, but we've automatically filtered out all the duplicates, and we've just done it like ourselves. We basically did it in 4, in total 4 scenario runs, as opposed to however many scenario runs it would have had to take, however many operations it would have had to consume if we had done this outside of things. There are so many cool array operations, and I'm actually going to be diving deep into how to use a couple of them, like map, for instance, which is heavily requested. If you learn how these array operations work, you can usually cut down your op spend by at least half on your average scenario that goes through tabular data. But that's not the purpose of this video, so I'm going to leave that for another one. Regardless, just know that if you're a little bit smart about how you aggregate data, do stuff to that data, you can always just iterate it afterwards, and then you could save yourself a ton of time, energy, and steps. So that's how you use both iterators and aggregators together, run array functions on them, and then just do cool stuff. Now, I actually show this in the subsequent module as well. Specifically, I think because I select like 50 or something instead of 5. And the purpose of this was I wanted to really quickly run you guys through what like the map function might look like. Hypothetically, let's say that, okay, you see how we have all of these functions. I'm just going to remove this duplicate here because it's not really required anymore. You see how we have profile URL, full name, and title. Let's hypothetically say we only wanted to grab the general dentists from this list. If you think about how we do this otherwise, this is the exact same scenario as before, by the way. If you think about how we would do this otherwise, if you don't use aggregators and iterators, you would have to basically manually use a filter. And after this filter, you'd have to say title is equal to general dentist here. This filter would run 50 times. Every subsequent module would then run a certain number of times. This would be very operation intensive, and to be honest, it would also take a little while longer than you realistically want it to. There's no need to run this whole thing 30 or 40 or 50 times. You could just do all of this in one fell swoop with a map function. Again, I'm not going to get into like the super crazy details of map functions. I'm just going to run a map function quite quickly for you guys. Then you guys can take a look at how that works. Basically, what we're going to be feeding in as our input is we're going to be feeding in an array. And then what we want is, let's say I just want to pull out the first names. I don't know. I just want the first names of people that are general dentists. You index it using this full name. Sorry, you actually don't even need that. You just write full name out. Actually, you don't do that. I lied. If you mouse over a variable here, you'll see that this variable has a raw name, a 0 in this case, a 1, or a 2. Basically, the way that raw names work are the variable names that we're seeing here, title, full name, profile URL. These are like human-friendly names, but the actual way the data is being represented under the hood is with these numbers. And so if you want to use the map function, you have to find the raw name, and that's what you have to pull out. I'll give you a quick example here. Let's say hypothetically I only want to pull out the full names from this array, and I only want to pull out the full names for people whose titles are equal to general dentist. I don't want to pull out anybody else except for the general dentists. What I would do is I'd write map array, so I feed in the array as the main element here, and then I go 1, which is the value of full name, then 2, which is the value of title, and then I'd write general dentist here. Essentially what I'm looking for is I'm looking for the full names where title is equal to general dentist. It's sort of how that works in like English. Now, if I were to run this whole puppy, what you'll see is we will feed in 50 values here because that's what we've output, a bundle with, a module with 50 bundle outputs. And then we will feed in that array here. The output will be 39 objects. We will essentially have instantly filtered out the 11 that aren't general dentists, and that will enable us to do things with this very, very quickly. Maybe we want to send like a personalized email to only people that, that are general dentists rather. Well, that's a very quick and easy way to do so. So again, we get to save a fair number of operations because we don't have to do like a row-wise thing. We don't have to like do an operation on a per bundle basis. We can do everything that we need here in basically 3 bundles, and then we could just convert it back to an iterator afterwards, right? Which just gives us the exact same functionality we had before. It's just now we've done it in 4 ops as opposed to God knows how many. So yeah, I've mentioned down here that this requires just 1 operation per module as opposed to 1 operation per module per bundle, which is fantastic. And it turns scenarios that otherwise would have been pretty annoying to deal with, that, you know, you might have to filter hundreds of records, into ones that you just have to filter once. Let's move on to our next scenario here, which is aggregator data is inaccessible outside of the flow. So if you've ever wondered why, when you add an aggregator to a flow and you select a source module, everything between the aggregator at the end there and then the source module at the beginning there turns gray, well, it's because make.com is just trying to tell you that, hey, all of the data inside of the confines of this gray stuff is inaccessible. You can't actually access it. The only data you get to access is the data from the output, the data from the aggregator. So almost in a way, you can think of this as just one big module, essentially. You just stack these. This is sort of like our big module, and we can only access the output of that module in subsequent modules. What do I mean by this? Well, I have a little example set up with the same idea. I'm searching through a bunch of rows, and then what I'm doing here is, for whatever reason, I'm setting the full name to lowercase, and that's sort of what's going on inside of this flow. And then I'm aggregating all of this data, and I'm aggregating the profile URL, the full name, and the title, okay? So I'm just gonna run this. And it's going to tell me that a transformer should not be the last module in the route. That's fine. So I'm just going to run this, and you'll see what happened. We ran this scenario once, and then the set full name lower instantly ran 50 times because it ran for every single, I shouldn't have done 50 ops, but screw it. It ran every single time for every single full name here. And then the output of this module 50 times was full name lower with the full lower name, right? So that's pretty cool. What if we wanted to access this, and maybe we wanted to index it later? Well, if I give this a click, hey, I can't see it anywhere. Where is set full name lower? The reason why you can't see it is because it's in this dark gray section. The only variables that are accessible to modules after the aggregator, after the gray section, is the last one, is the actual array aggregator. And that's why it allows you to pick the aggregated fields, because if you don't pick the aggregated field, it's just assuming that this is just some intermediary step you're doing to calculate something or whatever. So if I want to select this full name lower, and then let me, instead of running 50, wasting 50 of my operations, why don't I just waste 5? That sounds a little nicer. And then let's unlink this. If I run this now, you'll see that this ran a humble 5 times. Then the output of this is going to be an array with 5 items, and there'll be the full name lower associated with every single one of these records, right? So collection 3 was Kenny, collection 4, this is all the way on the right side of my screen. So apologies that was being cut off. Colin, this last one was Ibrahim, right? And now that I connect this to the inaccessible variable, well, now I can actually connect this, basically. Granted, keep in mind, because this is now in an array, I still do have to index it, right? But if I didn't want to index it, there are a variety of other things that I could do here. I could iterate this. I could turn this back into an array or something like that. I could also take, right over here, I could take the bundle order position. I could then run this, output this. I now have a variable called bundle order position. And then I could go back to inaccessible variables, and then I could pull the full name lower of the thing that has the bundle order position. So this will basically like nullify what I just did here. And so on and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's pretty interesting, pretty cool. And that's why aggregator data is inaccessible outside of the flow. You just can't, you can't select any data outside of the flow because make.com doesn't want you to. It doesn't really make any sense. I mean, think about it. This is going to run 5 times, and then everything after this is just going to run once. So how does it logically make sense that you should be able to access the data inside 5 times? You can't, right? All right, and down here I say you can get around this by using set and get variables. You can basically use whatever is occurring in the middle of this flow to generate something new. Like you could generate your own array and then pull it afterwards. And I'm just going to show you this for the purposes of being complete. I don't actually recommend that most people here do this. It just seems like sort of an unnecessarily complex data structure. But theoretically, let's say we have we start the scenario outside of the aggregator here, okay? And then I have a set multiple variables module here. And the first variable that I add is just going to be called example array. And so what I've done is I've gone to array and then I've said empty array. So I'm instantiating an empty array, all right? Then what I do inside of this aggregator is I will actually then get my example array. And then afterwards, I will set my example array. And it's going to be, we'll go add. I'm going to select my example array from before, and then I'm just going to add, let me think. I don't know, let's just say the bundle order position. So I'm adding the bundle order position to my example array. What this means is I'm going to have an array, and that array is going to populate itself with the current bundle order position that is coming out of this Google Sheets module on every subsequent run inside of the aggregator. And then what I'm going to do is after I'm done with all of the aggregation stuff, I'm then going to get my example array. So let me just go through here and make sure this is all good. Okay, great. We're selecting the right place. Awesome. Now that I think about it, we don't actually need this. We just need this. So I'm going to rename this for simplicity. Set example array. This is going to be get example array. The variable that we are then going to use from this is going to be add to example array. And then I just realized here that what we need is, we need this output here. And then aggregator names have just changed, so it needs me to refresh this. And then the variable that I'm going to get back here is this. All right, so watch what happens when I run this. Oh, sorry, I think there was a filter or something. Oh yeah, there was an additional module here from a previous test. Don't worry about that. Okay, give this thing a run. And let's see what happened. First of all, we set an example array. The example array was an empty array because we're using array functions, and this is just a predefined array function called create an empty array, basically. And so it starts off with 0 elements inside. We then go through the first stage in our aggregating flow, where we will search for rows, and then we will have 5 bundles. Now, because we're starting this with 5 bundles, that means every subsequent module inside of this until it's aggregated will run 5 times. So what we're doing is immediately after we run, we will get the example array. Now, the first time it runs, it's going to be empty. The second time it runs, though, there's going to be this value 1 in it. The third time it runs is going to be value 1 and 2. The fourth time it runs, it'll be 1, 2, 3. And the fifth time it runs, it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4. Why? Well, that's because after this, it's actually adding to an example array afterwards, right over here. So this is actually doing the add function, which we talked about, where it basically just grabs the current bundle number and then it adds it to the module. Then we will take all of this data and then we'll actually aggregate it and turn it into one variable, right? We'll turn it into an array again. Now, we didn't select anything inside of here, which is why all of the data inside is just the profile URL, full name, and title. But check this out. We use the get variable module afterwards. We get this variable, and it actually has all of the variables inside, or all of the numbers inside, even though we didn't access it using the array aggregator. So this is a little workaround that you can do to access things from within an aggregator flow, assuming that you know how to use the get and the set variables. There are a few instances in which you'll actually need this, aside from my content flow, which I'm going to show you in a moment. But this is just like an extra tool in your kit that you could use. Know that you can just set and pull and get, essentially, variables from anywhere in a make.com flow, as long as you just call them by name. Like, you notice how it says get example array? I'm not feeding in a variable here. I don't feed in the title. I actually just feed in the name example array. That's because the raw name of this array is called example array. So you need to just write it in like plain text like this. But all right, we are getting into some real edge cases now. Now we're going to talk about the 3 different kinds of aggregators. So I may have misled you up until now to think that there's actually just one type of aggregator, that there's just that green aggregator module, right? But it turns out there's actually 3 different types of aggregators, which are quite interesting. And not all of them are super valuable or useful. I'm going to talk about 2 of them. One's called the text aggregator, the other's called the numeric aggregator, and the last one's called the table aggregator, but I just never use the table aggregator. So personally, I wouldn't worry about it. I've made a fair amount of cashola with make.com at this point, and if I haven't needed the table aggregator to do it, I don't know. There are probably some edge cases in which you can, but you can also just format the data using anything else, so not a big deal. Yeah, so that's the text and the numeric aggregator. Let's actually go through some practical examples of what this looks like, though. I have a little example scenario set up called the 3 different kinds of aggregators. And inside of it, I have a Google Sheets search rows module. This is doing the same thing that our previous flows were. It's just instead of 50, I'm going to write 3. God, I'm a lunatic. What was I thinking? I then have a function here called full name lower. And the purpose of this is just to grab the full name, and again, just to make it lowercase. And then I have an array aggregator here. And what this is going to do is I just want to pull the full name lowercase, and then I also want to pull the profile name, full name, and title. You know, if you think about it logically, you don't actually need to do this within the aggregator. You could just make the full name lowercase afterwards, but screw it. We're having fun. All right, so if I run this now, I click run anyway, what do we expect is going to happen? We just outputted 5 bundles from the Google Sheets search rows module, right? Then we pass through here. Oh, sorry, I think I wrote 3. My bad. We just outputted 3 bundles from the search rows module. And then we passed it through this module here, which just turns all the full names to lowercase individually per bundle, right? And then we have an array aggregator, which took those 3, sort of like made it all big, and then it like turned that back into an array. And that's sort of like why it looks like this, right? We have multiple elements, and that's being converted into one array. Whereas the iterator looks the exact opposite. It has like, one array and is turning into multiple bundles. But anyway, what's the output of this? Well, it's an array with 3 elements with profile URL, full name, title, full name, lower. Profile URL, full name, title, full name, lower. Profile URL, full name, title, and full name, lower. This is expected behavior, right? But now let's look at these other 2 aggregators. We have one called numeric aggregator, and then we have another one called text aggregator. And this is pretty dang interesting to me. So why don't we use both? What I'm going to do is I'm going to unlink this array aggregator. Then I'm going to grab this text aggregator instead, and let's run through it and let's see how it works. The first field here that we can manipulate is the source module field. And you'll see it works very similarly to the green aggregator, where you can select what you want to be your source module. And what we want to be our source module is this Google Sheets search rows module. So I'm going to give that a click. And then what you see is this text field. And you're thinking, what the hell does this text field mean? Well, the really cool thing in this text field is basically for every element in your aggregated array, it'll just go through and then concatenate them all together. It'll just add them all together for you. What do I mean by that? If I go full name lower, and then afterwards I add a space, and then I give this thing a run, it will take all of those names and it will just concatenate them one after the other. So Kayla Pennington was the first, Irene was the second, Kenny was the third. And so this text aggregator, as you see here, you could use it to do quite a lot, to be completely honest. You could have this be like a list, for instance, of names or something. I don't know, maybe if you're trying to format an email or something, you could have this be a list of names where you have the full name lower, then you output this. And now you have this text with full name lower. If we go and we feed this back into an email, maybe you're trying to automate a function where you will email people with the content saying, these people have been very bad indeed. And then you feed in this text. I'm just going to say test. What'll happen when you run this thing is it's going to generate an email with this text saying, these people have been very bad indeed, Kayla, Irene, Kenny. And we were able to do that because we took all that data and then we just, we created like a big text string by iterating over the stuff in the aggregator. Essentially, we were able to do this with just one operation as opposed to having to split this into 2, where we grab all the elements from the array and then we have to iterate through them all manually. So the text aggregator just allows you to create like some pretty cool text strings, if I'm being honest. Whether these text strings are totally required, whether this module is totally required or not, I think that's up for debate. I don't really think it is. But you know, there's a lot that you could do with it. There's also a row separator. And the reason why I said that the table aggregator doesn't really do anything is because you could just do it all here with the row separator. You could have it be a new row. You could separate things by tab. Maybe every element is now separated by tab instead of a new line, for instance. So I'm going to unlink this, run this again. You know, and now you see it's separated by tab instead, right? The table aggregator does the same thing twice for some reason. But anyway, yeah, that's what the text aggregator does. And you can do a lot of things practically, like create a big list, for instance, of records that some staff member needs to check, or maybe you create an email that automatically sends it to people for their late payments with itemized invoice. There are a variety of functions that you could use text aggregators for, and I'm really just scratching the surface. The other function you could use is this numeric aggregator, and this functions similarly in that we select the source module, but then there's this additional field called aggregate function with average, sum, count, maximum value, and min. And what this really is this is just like a mathematical function. Let's hypothetically say, if I go back to our initial sheet here, and then I insert a new column, and I call this money. Let's say, for whatever reason, I'm counting up the money that these people owe us, okay? And I'm just going to pull 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 records. So I'm going to go back to my Google Sheet. I'm just going to click 5 because I want to pull this money field, okay? Now the source module I'm going to use is this Google Sheets. And what I want to count is I just want to count the total amount of money that all these people owe me. And because I haven't actually run this yet, I got to run this just once before I can fill out the money. There you go. What this numeric aggregator will do is it'll function similar to the text aggregator insofar that it will go through and then it will just let us do two things in one. Basically, it'll create an array with that data and then it'll just sum all of the numbers in that array for us. So, I mean, now it says sum 312 down there. Well, let's see what happens when we run this numeric aggregator. You'll see that the sum is 312. If hypothetically you wanted to count up the average amount of money that every person owed you, well, what it's sort of doing behind the scenes is it's creating an array and then it's calculating the average amount of money, 62.4. You could do count, you could count the number of elements, which is sort of superfluous. You don't really need to do that because we get all that data from Google Sheets anyway. You can count the minimum value. Maybe in an email you want to say, the least amount of money somebody owes us is $37. But then some people owe us as much money as $125, right? Variety of different ways that you could use the numeric aggregator. And while, none of these are mission critical or super important, they are just another tool in your tool belt that you could use. I use both the numeric aggregator and the text aggregator pretty commonly in my own flows, especially the text aggregator when I'm sending emails that pull from like tabular data, like a spreadsheet or a CRM, and then the numeric one anytime I'm calculating averages, doing sums, just doing some type of array number function. All right, now that we've learned basically everything we need to know about iterators and aggregators to actually make cool stuff happen, let me run through a practical example just to consolidate all of that knowledge and turn it into something that you guys can actually go out there and either sell or build for yourselves. So this is a real system, my content generator pipeline that I have sold for over $5,000. I've used it as part of my own business. I use it as part of a dozen or more businesses, and I've created a blueprint for this that I've given out to probably over 500 people by now, something like that, depending on how my Gumroad looks. Maybe it's more. This flow makes gratuitous use of iterators and aggregators. And basically, the reason why I'm showing you guys this is because if you understand what I'm about to show you, you basically get it. You sort of understand how these work. Sure, you may take this data or this knowledge and then try and make something yourself. And then it might not work the first few times. You might be like, why the hell is this data showing here? But you'll know enough that you'll be able to A, diagnose it very, very quickly. And then B, when you finally do get it, it'll be like that aha moment and you'll never struggle with it again. I'm talking about this because this is my experience as well. I've done basically exactly what a lot of the people that are watching this video are doing right now and are going through. So yeah, I'm just going to run you guys through this from top to bottom. Now, when I tried this about, 3 or 4 hours ago, the Claude API, which is what I use now as part of this flow, I was actually down. So I don't actually know if it's going to be up or if it's going to be working. So I'm just going to run this just a single time right now, just to give it a little peek, see how things are going. If our almighty Lord and Savior AI is down, then GG. No, it's not. Okay, great, it's up. Let me run you through what's going on here. Basically, what I have is I have a simple type form set up. A type form is just a form platform, if you guys are unfamiliar with how that works. And this form platform is just like a way that you can fill out, like give customers a very simple form and then map that into make.com. So if you haven't used Typeform before, I highly recommend it. It's very simple. I'm not going to go into the details of what that looks like. I'm just going to show you the input and the output. Essentially what we have is we have a, I just realized that is definitely not the data that I wanted to pull. WQDQWD. All right. Let me actually pull out the right data here. Geez, that's funny. Why don't we pull out, let's see. Let's do this one here. Okay, let's actually run this. Let's check out the mappable answers. That is definitely not correct. I used to do so much testing on this thing. That's probably why it's not. Why don't we just do 10 and then we'll just grab the last 10. Yeah, don't use Cyrillic when you're filling this format. Okay, great. So as you see, it's outputting multiple bundles. So this is the same type of module like the search rows module, insofar that it's listing a bunch of different responses. Then we have tons of little bundles here. Okay, so I'm going to grab the second last one, which is just, it looks like it's just some one about achieving a Hollywood level smile. Give this a run. Awesome, so that looks like it's working, so I'm actually just going to run this full thing. And basically what happens is first we're listing these responses, and we're just grabbing the responses to the form, okay? And, you can fill this form out. The second that you fill it out, it'll run this watch responses module, and then it'll trigger this, which actually just gets all the data for us. After that, what we're doing is I'm adding it to a Google Sheet. And I'm just adding it to a Google Sheet because I want to have all of that data stored somewhere. I basically want to know, hey, every time somebody fills out the form, what time did they fill out the form? Who are they that filled out the form? What data did they put in the form? Just so that if anybody ever goes WQWDDD again and puts in a bunch of Cyrillic characters, I can just look back and then be like, hey, y'all aren't using the form right. Then after we search rows, and you'll see what happens after we search the rows, right? You're thinking this is a list, this is a search iterator module, so it should probably output multiple bundles, right? But I've actually set the number of returned rows to 1. And so in this case, we're only getting 1 bundle from that module. So we're not iterating through, we're not automatically creating multiple runs from then on. Afterwards, we're setting variables. I have a bunch of variables set up here, which I will show you in just a moment after this flow completes. But essentially, we have a bunch of variables set up, and those variables include things like title, word count, primary word count, secondary keywords, internal links, external links, as well as some additional instructions. And the reason why I'm turning this from a form previously and just resetting all of these variables here is just because I personally think it's a little simpler. And moreover, it becomes really easy to test flows when you have a couple of set variables modules, because in the future, if you ever just want to run this whole scenario on your own data, like you're not 100% sure that this is going to work, so you just want to like try it with hard-coded data, you don't actually have to like change all of the data, every single one of these. You only have to change the set variables module, because as long as everything subsequently from then on is pulling from the set variables module, you'll be good. Let me show you what I mean. If I give this a click, you see we have title, word count, primary keywords, secondary keywords. We have some logic here, but that's unimportant. Notice how the Claude prompt is actually pulling directly from this. So in the future, if I ever wanted to change this and I just wanted to say, you know what, I just want to run a hard-coded test on like how to make pineapple pizza because I am the spawn of Satan, I would just add the data here, and then from future modules that pull from this, it would just all pull, like the data would just be formatted perfectly correctly. It'd be pulling from the right module. In the future, if I wanted to switch this back, all I'd have to do is go here and then switch this to title and click OK. So it's just a much easier testing paradigm. Anyway, from then on, what I'm doing is I'm getting AI, so Anthropic Claude specifically, to produce a whole outline in what's called Markdown format of the content. So introduction, definition of Hollywood smells, the evolution of the Hollywood smell, et cetera, et cetera. And then once I have all this stuff, I'm using the Markdown to HTML module to convert this Markdown format. And Markdown is just anything with like a hashtag like this. That stands for an H1, this stands for an H2. It's just like a different way to format. And it's taking this big input and it's turning this into output of HTML. Now, the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to be able to make a Google Docs outline really quickly. And basically, Google Docs requires that I have a like HTML as input. So, that's how I'm getting these headings and these introductions and all this stuff, right? That's how I'm basically generating this content, all together. And now we're starting to get to the interesting parts, because now we're about to get to the iterator. So what happens after is I will take this and I will create what's called an input brief. I'll basically take the output of Claude right over here. And again, you're probably wondering, hey, why are you using a set variable module to like just add Claude input when you could just use this as your input? Well, the reason why is, again, I just want to be able to test this flow very quickly. So I'm just taking, if I ever have like a hard-coded thing, I would just write it right here. And then the rest of my flow would use that variable. But this is where things get interesting, and this is where the iterator starts coming into play along with the aggregator. As you see, what we're doing is we're iterating through something, and then what we're doing, because you can see by the presence of the gray, we are then aggregating all of the section text using the text aggregator, right? This is a practical usage of that aggregator. We're also setting inputs, setting section text, and then getting inputs and getting section text, which is pretty interesting. In light of the fact that I ran you guys how to do that over here with getting and setting example arrays. But okay, great. So what are we actually doing and how does this work? So after we get the input brief, right, we now just have a variable with the results of the previous Claude thing, which is just a big markdown outline. What we're doing is we are iterating over this text. And the way that I'm iterating is, first I'm creating an array. And I'm creating an array by splitting this input brief into how do I show you guys this simply? Okay, so this is the input brief right here, right? And what I'm doing is I'm basically finding every new line and I'm using that to cut this thing into an array. So now this is one element. This is another 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 element, so on and so on and so forth, okay? I'm splitting this by the presence of a new line, and that's why if you look at the output, you'll see here that this is 56 elements inside. Because what I do is I split it and then I iterate over it. So that's what this iterator module is doing, which turns an array with 56 elements in it up here into 56 different bundles, basically, which all run independently. Next, I look to see if the section starts with an H2. So if the value of this output starts with an H2, starts with these two hashtags, I know that it's like a heading, right? It's like this is going to be a section that we're going to write. It's going to be at least a few paragraphs in there. So if it doesn't start with those two, then I don't worry about it. And there are other ways that you could have done that. I could have done this. I could have mapped over it and looked for the presence of contains, two hashtags or something. I could have done this a variety of other ways, but I chose to use a filter. And so what it did is it found that we had 11 H2s inside of this big outline. And then for every H2, we're now going to generate content for it. The real tricky and nifty way of doing so is we will set the section input of this flow, which essentially is a really shitty name for it. But what we'll do is we will replace the whole, we'll go into this input brief, which I showed you back over here, which is just the whole text chunk of the outline in Markdown. And we will replace the text that we found with the heading with the same text plus this little arrow. And if you're unfamiliar with how AI works in general, one of the big issues with generating content is AI will usually lose its place and sort of forget where it is and forget why it's doing what it's doing. So this is a way that we can basically just create a whole nother brief. So we just duplicate the exact same brief, but the only thing we do that's different is we will add a little arrow next to the section that we want it to write on. And I'll show you guys why, and you're going to have an aha moment if you haven't already. But essentially this section input then looks like, actually let's go to the second one here. This section input now looks like this. We have the exact same outline. The only difference is we have an arrow next to the heading that we're going to be writing. And so this is what we're feeding into AI. And what we're saying to the AI is, hey, I want you to write a section, but only for the heading that has the arrow next to it. And the reason why is because we want it to know what it talked about before. We want it to know what it talked about after, but we don't want to have to spend all the tokens in order to do it. And the quality of AI tends to go down the longer the token count is. So this is just a way for it to be like, hey, shit, I probably talked about the impact of perfect smiles in popular cultures. I talked about the components of a Hollywood smile after. So in this section, I'm going to talk about this and that and that and that. And I'm going to lead into the next paragraph and I'm going to lead out, right? So what we do is we take that, and that's what we feed as input into this. The following is an outline for an award-winning article. Your task is to write one section only, the one marked by an arrow. Write in a way that's accommodating of previous and future paragraphs, tone of voice, mildly Spartan. Obviously, the prompt depends on whatever the hell you want, but then we feed in the section input. Now notice that we're still doing this within the Iterator and Aggregator dark section, right? So we basically written this, but none of this is accessible to future modules. And so in order to do stuff with this, what we need to do is we then set a section text over here, which is we set the text that we just generated and we put that in its own variable. So you see it wrote a big section on Hollywood smiles over here, right? That's the first section. This is the second section. That's a tongue twister. And I'm going to avoid this route just for now. But what we do is after we set this, we will then get it. We do it because of this other function, which I'll show you above, but we get it again, and then we just feed all that into a text aggregator here. And so all we're doing is we're just aggregating it, we're just sticking it all together, and we do it one section after another using this get section text. So if you know what I've talked about over the course of the last hour and a half, if you've gotten to that point, everything that I've talked about so far should make sense to you. There are a bunch of gets and sets, and you may be unfamiliar with that specific design pattern, but the actual iterator part where we will split the input brief based off a new line. So now we have an array with 56 elements, and then we feed that into an iterator. Well, it's going to be 56 bundles. Then we run 56 bundles. We're using a filter. It only gets 11 of them. And then because we have 11 bundles remaining, it's going to run every module at least 11 times, right? All of this stuff should be pretty familiar to you. You should sort of get it. At the end, what we do is we get a section text. And then the section text, as you see, we feed in 10 or 11 bundles, all with their own paragraphs and stuff. What we do is we aggregate it all together, and then voila, we have the full article here, which is, super crazy long usually. Yeah, it's like 1,500 to 2,000 words. Then what we do is we will convert the markdown to HTML. So we'll turn all that markdown back into HTML, and then we'll be able to create an article with it in Google Docs, which then you can just open up and take a look at here. And it doesn't look very nicely formatted here just because I haven't set the formatting. Oops, didn't want to do that. But if you add some spaces and stuff like that, it looks pretty good, right? And that's how the AI content generator works. Now, there's one section that I missed out on, and this is a pretty interesting section, but I would consider pretty advanced. But essentially what we've done is within the iterator and aggregator flow, what I came to realize after I generated some of this stuff was that a lot of the time the sections just looked really, really repetitive, and it was just the same sort of thing, just nonstop paragraph after paragraph after paragraph. And I wanted to make it a little different. I wanted to spice it up a bit. So what I did is I created a route here. And inside of that route, I had two subsequent modules. One here, which fed into the rest of my aggregator flow, which is why it's under a dark section. And then another here, which has 25% on it. And what I did here is I set a function up where basically if I basically gave it a 25% chance of running that route. And 25% of the time I'd run the route. The other 25% of the time I wouldn't run the route. If it did run the route, 25% of the time, what I'd do is I'd feed it into AI, and then I would edit the text to break up the flow to add bullet points and subheadings where needed for variety. Essentially, all that this does, all that the purpose of this is to do is just to add a couple of additional ways to spice up the content a bit. So it's just not all just a huge block of text, essentially. And then notice that after that run, I would set the section text, and then it would go down here and then get the section text. So this is sort of how it worked. It would complete the run. It would then get the section text of the previous run right over here. And then, that's how I'd basically build the content in a slightly more interesting manner, which is pretty fun. So I'm just going to unlink both of these. Then I'll link this back up here, link this back over here. So yeah, that is it in a nutshell. If you understood what I use the iterators and the aggregators for right here, then you know more than enough to go out and make real money with make.com. I firmly salute everybody that has made it to the end of this lovely video. I had a lot of fun putting it together. Essentially, if I could take home one thing here, essentially if I could just drive home one point here, it would be that iterators turn an array into a set of bundles, and then aggregators turn a set of bundles into an array. And that's it. The only real value of aggregators are that they allow you to utilize array functions on data that otherwise would have came in a bundle format. And the only real value of iterators are they allow you to dynamically access internal variables that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to unless you would have done something silly like array indexed. Now that you know everything that you need to know about iterators and aggregators, you should be good to get out there and make some real money with make.com, because if you've been operating without them up until now, you've probably been reasonably limited. Thanks so much for watching this video. I really appreciate your guys' time. If you guys have any questions about how iterators or aggregators work, just drop a comment down below. I'm more than happy to attend to it. I have a blast putting these together and answering specific make.com questions. So if there's anything else that you guys want to know, as I mentioned, I'm going to be covering map. I'm going to be covering a couple of other array functions soon. Just drop them down and I'll use them as inspiration for my next video. Otherwise, please like, subscribe, do all that fun YouTube stuff that gets me a little bit more visibility. And I will catch y'all in the next video. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.